Mrs. Kate at the Library of Whispers, and this is the second part of a reading about the pirate Captain William Kidd. So let us find the page that we were up to. So, just to show you, this is the ship that belonged to Captain William Kidd, the Adventure Galley. When she was launched in 1695 at the Thames River shipyard of Deptford, Captain William Kidd's ship Adventure Galley was the latest in fighting vessels designed for speed, manoeuvrability, and firepower. The Adventure Galley was equally suited as the privateer for which she was intended, or as the pirate ship she soon became. So we can take a look at that again at some point, but for now, let's carry on with the story. Okay. William Moore, the gunner on the Adventure Galley, proposed that they plunder the vessel anyway. Kidd refused to consider it. "I dare not do such a thing," he said. "We may do it," cried Moore. "We are beggars already." The English ship proved to be the Loyal Captain, outward bound from Madras to Surat. All her papers were in order, and Kidd let her go. This infuriated his crew. A few brought out their small arms, but Kidd faced them down. He had not come here to take any Englishmen or lawful traders. "If you desert my ship," Kidd told them, "you shall never come aboard again, and I will force you into Bombay, and I will carry you before some of the council there." The mutiny fizzled out, but not the rancour. On October the 30th, 1697, Captain Kidd and Gunner Moore had their final confrontation. According to a teenage deckhand named Hugh Barrett, the quarrel began as Moore, who had been ill, sat grinding a chisel on deck. When the captain appeared, Moore shouted at him, "Captain, I could have put you in the way to have taken the ship, and have never been the worse for it." According to Barrett, this put Kidd in a passion, so much so that the lad took refuge below decks. Other hands remained up top. Moore continued to upbraid the captain. "You have brought us to ruin, and we are desolate," he railed. "Have I brought you to ruin?" cried Kidd. "I have not done an ill thing to ruin you. You are a saucy fellow to say those words." According to a sailor named Palmer, Kidd did not say saucy fellow, but lousy dog. To which Gunner Moore screamed, "I am a lousy dog. You have made me so." All agree about what happened next. The captain, now beside himself with fury, yelled, "Have I ruined you, you dog?" And with that he seized an iron-bound bucket worth 8 pence of lawful English money, his prosecutors were to point out later, and crashed it against Moore's head, a little above the right ear. The gunner's shipmates carried Moore below as the captain cried out after them, "Damn him, he is a villain." Moore died the next day of a fractured skull. A stunned and sullen peace descended on the wretched Adventure Galley. Weeks went by. Then at the end of November, 4 leagues from Calicut, they sighted a sail. she was spotted from the lookout of the Adventure Galley. Crowding on sail, Kidd pursued her for 4 hours. When he finally came up with her, he fired across her bows and hoisted his French flag. Kidd ordered the merchantman's master to come on board the Adventure Galley, yet it was not Captain Wright who arrived, but an old French gunner posing as the captain, whereupon, to the Frenchman's great surprise, Kidd ran up the English flag and claimed the vessel as a prize. And so it seemed at first. The old gunner handed him a pass signed by the Director General of the Royal French East India Company in Bengal only a fortnight before. But as with November, the fact that the Quedah merchant carried a French pass did not make her a French ship. Her Armenian owners were on board and offered to ransom the ship for nearly £3,000, an offer Kidd scorned as insufficient. Instead, he sold some cargo on shore for £10,000, divided the proceeds among the crew, and sailed to Madagascar with both the November and the Quedah merchant as prizes. It was only when they had been sailing for 5 or 6 days that the true identity of the Quedah merchant's master was revealed. Captain Wright was brought before Kidd, and Kidd was horrified to discover that he had unwittingly broken even his own rules. And captured. An Englishman's command. Only now, perhaps, did he become fully aware of the extent to which he had compromised himself. He summoned the crew and addressed them from the quarter-deck. The taking of this ship would make a great noise in England, he told them. He proposed that they should hand the Quedah merchant back to Captain Wright, but his crew would not hear of it, and so the 3 ships continued on their course. On April Fool's Day, 1698, the tiny fleet finally reached Madagascar. Ironically, the harbour they entered was the pirates' haven of St. Mary's Island, and for the first time in his 2-year cruise, the pirate catcher was confronted with a pirate ship. Riding at anchor in St. Mary's was the Mocha frigate, a captured East Indiaman whose captain, Robert Culliford, had turned pirate after serving on a privateer. Even now, Kidd was torn between his duty and his destiny. Although he had gone pirate, he still dreamed of catching pirates. He urged his men to seize the Mocha. They howled with derision. They told him they would rather fire 10 shots at him than one of the pirates, and began to share out the spoils of the Quedah merchant. Curiously, it was a privateer, Shercott, for Kidd got a full 40 shares of the plunder, not the usual 2 shares accorded a pirate captain. After that, however, all but 13 of his men deserted to Culliford, including Robert Brandingham and Joseph Palmer, who later testified for the prosecution at Kidd's trial, sealing his terrible fate. They sacked and burned the November. Next, they clambered all over Kidd shallows. She could sail no further. Kidd had her stripped and her hull burned for its iron. He then fitted out the bulky Quedah merchant for the voyage home, and began the difficult task of recruiting crew from the nautical flotsam drifting around the islands. He had plenty of time, for he had to wait 5 months before the northeast monsoons could blow him around the Cape. At last, on November 15th, 1698, the Quedah merchant weighed anchor in St. Mary's Harbour. Kidd seems to have had no qualms about the wisdom of returning home. His family awaited him, he had property to attend to, and he undoubtedly believed that he still had enough cargo in goods, jewels, silver and gold to square accounts with his powerful sponsors. Captain Kidd was only 3 days out from St. Mary's when the East India Company wrote a letter from its headquarters in Surat to the Lords Justices in London, in which a number of extreme accusations of piracy were levelled against him. The charges fell on receptive ears. To Kidd's high-placed backers, Lord Somers, now Lord High Chancellor, Lord Orford, First Lord of the Admiralty, Lord Shrewsbury, Lord Chief Justice, and Lord Romney, Privy Councillor. It had long been obvious that their opportunist effort at merchant venturing was a dismal flop. There had been no decrease in the incidents of piracy. As for Kidd, there had been no news but uncomplimentary rumour. Now it seemed their worst fears were confirmed. The response of the Lords Justices was vigorous and immediate. They ordered a naval squadron on the point of sailing to the Indian Ocean to capture Kidd. At the same time, the Admiralty dispatched a circular letter to the governors of the American colonies, ordering them to apprehend Kidd so that he and his associates be prosecuted with the utmost rigour of the law. Finally, with the object of isolating Kidd, a free pardon was offered to every pirate east of the Cape, except Kidd and 2 other captains, one of whom was Henry Every. The news spread like smoke throughout England. A first-class political scandal erupted as Tory opposition politicians ripped into the 4 Whig lords who had sent Kidd off in the Adventure Galley. William Kidd had become an arch-criminal, guilty of the most unspeakable crimes, and in the eyes of the government, the East India Company, the press, and the general public, he was found guilty before he had set foot on land, or so much as uttered a word. Such was the situation when, this time £1,000 worth of gold bars sewed up in a green silk bag. She immediately sent them back. The next day, Kidd was interviewed by Bellamont, sitting in council in his house. The captain was coldly asked for a detailed account of his movements and leaving England. He replied somewhat truculently that his crew had destroyed his log. The governor and council ordered him to prepare a report. Kidd either could not or would not. Finally, on July the 6th, all patience at an end, the council voted for Kidd's immediate arrest. The police searched. High and low for the better part of a day, and eventually found him outside the front door of Bellamont's house. He tried to draw his sword, broke away, and rushed into the house. He was caught and his arms pinned in the presence of the chief instigator of the voyage for which he was now being accused, the Captain General and Governor-in-Chief, in and over His Majesty's provinces of the Massachusetts Bay and Governor of New York, His Excellency Richard, Earl of Bellamont. Bellamont had Kidd clapped into the stone prison in solitary confinement in irons weighing 16 pounds, and from the moment of his confinement he was treated like a wild animal. Monster is how Bellamont described the old captain to Lord Somers. For tainting its good name, the English establishment was to exact a terrible revenge. At the start, a frantic search was made to uncover Kidd's treasure. His lodgings were ransacked, and their contents, even his clothes and his wife's things, were bundled away. His gifts to various friends were collected, the sloops that had carried off cargo were tracked down, and his treasure on Gardiner's Island was dug up. 3 weeks after his arrest, an inventory was made of recovered booty: 1,111 ounces of gold, 2,353 ounces of silver, more than £1 of precious stones, 57 bags of sugar, 41 bales of merchandise. The entire proceeds were shipped under close guard to the Treasury in England. visitors often brought bunches of flowers to bury their noses in, and prisoners were washed with vinegar before they appeared in court. Unbelievably, the prison was run as a private business. Prisoners were made to pay rent for their cells, and jailers exacted extortionate fees for everything. Now, here is a picture, an illustration of Newgate jail. In this dark, noisome, clamorous, cavernous hole, William Kidd lay in close confinement for more than a year. In May 1700, his jailer reported to the Admiralty Board. Captain Kidd was troubled with a great pain in his head and shaken in his limbs, and was in great want of his clothes. He was allowed no exercise until the new year, and no visitors except an elderly uncle and aunt. He was not allowed to write letters to his wife or to discuss his case with anyone or prepare his defence. He lay old and ailing in a total vacuum. At the end of March 1701, Kidd was suddenly called before the House of Commons. The abrupt transition from prison to Parliament would have been difficult under the best of circumstances. Kidd did not perform well, though some members of the House admired his courage. Most found him boorish and truculent, and one thought he was drunk. What the House wanted to hear about was not Kidd's personal case, but the degree of culpability of the syndicate of Whig lords who had backed him. If he had involved the Whig statesmen who had sponsored his voyage, betrayed them as villains, and himself as their victim, he might have yet won a pardon from the Tories. But Kidd had no flair for political intrigue. Instead, he continued to plead his innocence, and by implication, therefore, that of the Whig ministers. "I had thought him only a knave," one member commented. "Now I know him to be a fool as well." The next day, the House recommended that he should be proceeded against according to law. The trial was fixed for May the 8th. Kidd had spent nearly 2 years in prison by the time he appeared in the dock at the Old Bailey. This itself was injustice enough, but it was compounded by 2 further injustices. In the first place, the vital pieces of evidence with which questions, the court clerk repeated. No, no, it signifies nothing, Kidd muttered, and as the trial drew to a close, he broke in. Mr. Bradingham, are not you promised your life to take away mine? The jury was out for scarcely half an hour. They found Kidd and 6 of his co-defendants guilty. 3 were acquitted. What canst thou say for thyself? The clerk of the court asked Kidd. Why, thou shouldst not die according to law. I have nothing to say, replied Kidd, but that I have been sworn against by perjured and wicked people. You have been tried by the laws of the land, the clerk continued. Nothing now remains but that sentence be passed according to the law, and the sentence of the law is this. You shall be taken from this place where you are, and to be carried to the place from whence you came, and from thence to the place of execution. And there be severally hanged by your necks until you are dead, and the Lord have mercy on your souls. My lord, said Kidd, it is a very hard sentence. I am the innocentest person of all. Only I have been sworn against by perjured people. When Captain Kidd was strung up for a second time at Wapping, the new rope held, and since he was a heavy man, he probably died quickly. When he had stopped twitching, the executioner cut him down and chained his body to a post and left it there until the tidal waters of the Thames had ebbed and flowed over it 3 times, as Admiralty law prescribed. Then the body was recovered and painted with tar, and bound with chains, and the head set in a metal harness, so that the bones and skull would stay in place when the tissues rotted. It was hung from a gibbet specially constructed at a cost of £10 at Tilbury Point, at a place where it could be seen plainly by everyone sailing in and out of the Thames, so that it would serve in the words of the Admiralty's final instructions regarding Captain William Kidd, as a greater terror to all persons from committing ye-like crimes for the time to come. And here is an illustration of the body in the gibbet. No one knows for sure